We started, last week in the message, I went down a road that I was talking to one of the praise team members about this morning. And it's a road that I was so afraid that in going there, it would become or seen as political statements, because I was talking about truth. And when you start talking about truth in today's world, people take up sides, and it quickly becomes political in a secular way. And we tried to draw a different view last week to say real truth is not found just in our opinions. It's found outside of ourselves through God, and God informs us about that truth and does that in Scripture. So today I'm sort of pivoting off of that message of last week, because we're going to start a new series, and it'll go as long as you allow me to do it. If you get tired of it, we'll stop it. But it's a curious thing. I'm going to be talking a bit about common sense. Common sense. Can you imagine that? Common sense in worship. Common sense in faith. So I found a passage that I think portrays that at least it uses the word common sense, believe it or not. It's a parable you've heard probably many times. It's the parable about the wise and the foolish builder. As I'm reading this passage to you, this parable, I want you to listen for the words of wisdom and how we get that wisdom. Okay, you with me? Pay attention to that when we get there. I'll be reading out of Matthew. It's Matthew 7, verses 24 through 29. 7:24 through 29. Listen for the word of God. Everyone then who hears these words of mine, this is Jesus. Jesus is speaking. He's speaking to the crowds. He's speaking to his disciples, and he says, everyone who hears these words of mine, not just hears, but acts on them, will be like a wise, the radar should go off, there's the wisdom word, be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and it beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell, and great was its fall. May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. So I ask you to pay attention for the wisdom words, the sound of wisdom, where it comes from, how we get there. But to begin the message today, I'm going to take a little bit of a change. It's been a very lovely worship, and it's been quite uplifting, but I have something sad to report, because I came across an obituary this week, and I just felt like it was very important for me as the pastor, lead pastor of the church, to present this. So I want to read you this obituary. It says this: today we mourn the passing of a beloved old friend. Common sense. No one knows his age, since his birth records were lost long ago in bureaucratic red tape. Common sense will be remembered as having lived by knowledge and reason, and having learned important life lessons, such as, this is where you get to participate, know when it's time to come out of the rain. Wow, we haven't even gotten down the list, and you're not doing too well. The early bird gets the a penny saved is a stay on the straight and what? Okay, you're making up for yourself. I take it all back. Get to the heart of the go the extra. Hold your. That doesn't feel good, by the way. Life isn't always fair. I love that one. That's a good one. And admit when it's your fault. Great. So, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek, making fun of common sense today. But I think there really is something to this idea that common sense has sort of gone away or died. And here's how I know. Not only did I read the obituary, but this is actually true. Have you looked at the warning labels on stuff you buy? No, I'm serious. You look at these warning labels and you want to think, Oh my gosh, has somebody actually done this that they have to put a warning, or there was a lawsuit or something? But here you go. I want to go through just a couple of these that I think are just, it's so common sense, but evidently not for everyone. The first one is a Nitol ad, Nitol. So it's going to pop up there. There it is. It says on there, it's a clinically proven nighttime sleep aid. Warning, this may cause drowsiness. Who would have thought Nitol would do that? It's the second one. It says, warning, do not hold the wrong end of the chainsaw. Now, that's the first thing I do when I go to start my chainsaw is I hold the wrong end while I'm trying to start it up. I don't know about you. How about this one? Vidal Sassoon, hairdryer, like a hairdryer, right? Do not use while sleeping. Now, I don't know how many of you do that, but stop, because it says don't do that while you're sleeping. It could be very bad. Here's a great one for, these, this is like a little caterpillar kind of mover thing, and it says avoid death. I'm glad they told me to avoid that death, because probably I'd get in there and that's the first thing I would do is not avoid death. Here you go. Windshield block, right? This is, how many of you have one of these? My wife, Elisa, has one of these. She puts it up in the car, windshield blocks. It says, do not drive with the car sun shield in place. You think? Really? I can't imagine that. Here's one, egg carton. What do you think's on the egg carton? This contains eggs. Oh my gosh, common sense, right? How about this one? Warning label on, this is a washing machine. This is a washing machine. It says, do not put any person in the washer. Now, I guess it's okay to put him in the dryer, but it specifically said washer, and if you've done that with your child, that's not smart. Do not do that. Here is one that was just a little crazy, but I liked it. Fox and bobcat urine powder, okay? I don't know what you're supposed to use this for, but it says not for human consumption. Really? Really? Common sense has it still with us. And the last one, I like this. Superman costume, right? What's wrong? What kind of warning would you have to put on a Superman costume? Really, right? You got it. It says the costume does not enable flight or super strength. Now, I think they should have used this picture. And they could have said, it would have made sense, right? This costume, well, maybe you could fly away in that thing. I don't know. But I'm going to tell you, those are absolutely real warning labels. There's thousands. Go home today. You can just spend the rest of your day looking up warning labels to see how silly they are. But obviously, common sense is a bit weak in our society and culture today, or you wouldn't have to put those labels up there. Someone said, common sense is so rare today, it probably should be considered a superpower. And I'm like, yeah, because I'm big on common sense. I'm a big common sense guy. I would say a fair share of the misunderstandings that Elisa and I have, that's a nice way of saying arguments, okay? A fair share of the conversations and misunderstandings that Elisa and I have in our marital relationships falls under the category of unique perspectives of what common sense really is, right? Because I'll say, well, you should have known, that was common sense. And she'll, no, it wasn't. And here's what real common sense is. So, last week, as I said in the message, we dove into that kind of convoluted and murky waters of truth, really. What is truth? And in that message, I shared what scientists have learned is that our brains are hardwired to create our own truths, right? We'll fill in the gaps. It doesn't matter what we see. We'll create sort of a truth that becomes a bit relative. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to common sense. Common sense seems to be a bit relative. What I feel to be absolutely a common sense or easily deduced, right, chain of events, a way of thinking, it may be the opposite for you. It may not even occur in your wildest dreams. But some things in this world are so, I guess to quote what we talked about last week, the Declaration of Independence, overwhelmingly self-evident that I would think we would all get it. We would just all know it'd be universally held common sense. Like, if you touch a hot stove that your parents tried to teach you. Paige, you probably checked this out to see if it was really true, right? If you touch a hot stove, what will happen? You will get burned. How many people have ever touched a hot stove? Okay. I think I can stop the sermon right there. How many people think if I'm going to go ahead and run this red light? It's like I'm about to go through it, and you're going, well, there's a probability it'll cause an accident, but it may not be 100%. So if the probability isn't high enough, I guess I'm going to go straight through it. I'm not going to ask you to commit to whether you have run those red lights before. I will tell you, on occasion, it has happened that my foot slipped off the brake and hit the accelerator pedal, and I went through that red light. I watched 3 people run a red light behind me yesterday. Like, I barely made it through, and then 3 more cars. And I guess they're thinking, hey, nothing's going to happen. So, common sense, that's me. I'm all about it. But what is it really? What is this thing we call common sense? And why do some of us, in our opinions, seem to have it, while others seem not to have it? I love what W.C. Fields said. W.C. Fields was a vaudevillian comic way back in the 20s and 30s. Kara told me some people won't know who doesn't know who W.C. Fields is? You don't know who W.C. Fields is? Oh, okay. I thought to say, okay, W.C. Fields, comic guy, he said we can learn a lot about common sense from horses. Imagine that. He said, horse sense is the thing a horse has which keeps it from betting on people. That's a good one. That's pretty good. Some say common sense is simply, it's sound judgments, right? Sound judgments in practical matters. But I think there's something more to it. It's more than that. I went to Webster, the authority, right, and looked it up. Webster says this. There it is on your screen. Common sense is the ability to reach intelligent conclusions. And they go on to kind of define sense. It implies the ability to judge, reliable ability to judge and decide with soundness, prudence, intelligence. That's pretty good. I found a couple more, though, that seemed to get at it. Josh Billings said this: common sense is the ability to see things as they are, right? See things as they are without prejudice, and do things as they ought to be done without influence of any kind. The sense behind that is you almost can foresee what's going to happen. It's almost like this prophetic thing that happens that you kind of know what's going to happen before it happens. And I like that. That kind of fits with my definition. But here it is. Here's Pastor Joe's definition to common sense. Are you ready? It's a little convoluted, but stick with me. It's the expectation of a thing, the certainty or absolute that has been proven historically, experientially, and through our personal familiarity, education, and intellect that will tell us the thing is going to happen. How do you like that? I don't even get applause. I worked hard on that. So, what does all of this, confusion over common sense say about our belief in God? Right? Because if we're having these different opinions and common sense seems to be fleeting, is there any link in there with our belief in God? Does it affect our belief in God? If a thing happens historically, experientially, through knowledge, teaching, or intellect, would we still ignore it when it comes to our faith? Would we just risk the consequence? When I started thinking about this, there's really 3 possibilities when we see God say something to us and it doesn't click in as common sense, or maybe it does click in as common sense and we still don't do it, like touching the hot burner. 3 possibilities is the first one is whatever God's telling us to do isn't true. Well, I don't like that one very much. The second is it's not really going to happen to me. That's the red light thing. I'm going to run through it. I'm going to make it. There's a high probability. The third is I never expected it to happen. And if you put those things to faith, wow, I think we're in trouble. I know you're all familiar now with the new law, right, about these things in the car. New law about driving, texting while driving. It's not like we didn't have enough traffic accidents before these little things came out, right? But now we're going to be looking to be distracted even more by having whole conversations, by pressing little small icons with our thumbs on a small screen while we're pressing the gas or pressing the brake, while looking ahead and looking behind and to the right and to the left, watching the markings on the street, and by the way, watching for the occasional squirrel. Does it make sense? I've done it. I'm not going to ask you to it is church, you could tell the truth, but but we do it. And you know what's really tough about this and why the series, I get excited about it, is because I see people do things like this, and the net outcome is, why in the world didn't God protect me, right? Why didn't God prevent the accident? And I want to say, God gave us wisdom and a mind and the ability to have some godly sense about what we do. It's not common sense to risk hurting ourselves by texting while driving. I've been so convicted over this series. I have Siri, so I can talk to it now, but even that's a bit of distraction. So what does the common sense rule have to do with faith? That's really what the series is about. What does it have to do? I found a writer had something really wonderful to say about this. She wrote a little article called The Death of Common Sense. Her name is Sherry Abbott. She said, as Christians, we know that the answer to the confusion of our world is to make sense of all things using truths of God. And I think people of faith would say, yeah, I think we try to do that. She goes on to say, only by looking outside of ourselves. That was part of the point of last week's talk about truth. Looking outside of ourselves and beyond our finite and fallen world. That's where we can find a transcendent God who knows all, sees all, is all powerful to work in our lives for his glory. Yeah, we want to make sense. But shouldn't we make sense in a way that glorifies God? Or at least listen to what God has to say. And so I applied that little rule to the scripture today. It may shock you, but when Jesus was teaching in his day, when he's telling stories like this parable, he's really being quite the radical. You know, we see some people being quite radical in the world today and in our country. You go, oh, they're so radical. Radical on the far right, radical on the far left. If Jesus was here today, we'd be saying the same thing. This guy is so radical. He's a radical thinker. He's turning everything upside down. What's this guy about? Even theologians today still consider Jesus' words quite radical. But I think they're important words, and I think he meant them to be a bit radical because he wanted to offer some common sense, godly common sense, to a confused world. And the world was just as confused in Jesus' day. So, how much, question to you, rhetorical, how much of Jesus' common sense falls in the high probability column for you? You know, that's when you're making those determinations. If I do A, B will happen. What's the probability? How much of Jesus' common sense he's given to us falls in the high probability category? Or maybe it's just mild probability or low probability. Is it more like an absolute? Or is it something more? Should I expect it? If I act a certain way, if I speak a certain way, if I worship a certain way, what is it that I should expect might really happen? Should I disregard some of the things Jesus says, or should I incorporate them more? I think this whole idea of common sense is very problematic for us, of people of faith, for Christians. But Jesus wants to step right into that. He wants to make corrections. You know, I read one person said that happiness comes from using common sense when solving problems. And maybe Jesus had that in mind when he offers us certain teachings. That's why in this series of the next few weeks, we're going to look at how Jesus used common sense in a time just like ours, when other folks weren't doing it. They weren't using common sense. And he wants us to use that common sense to solve our problems between us, problems in how our communities work, modern day problems. So as I'm wrapping this up today, this is just a foundation to move on. I want to just dip our toes a little bit into some examples of personal common sense wisdom. If you look up that word wisdom in the Bible, there are countless references. There's probably over 100 references to wisdom in the Bible. I'm just going to pick out a couple. You can find in Genesis 41, 33 through 39. Don't worry about that. You can look it up later. But it's this idea of being wise in order to grasp the meaning of something, to have comprehension. And this is the example that was given to Joseph. Joseph was seen as being this wise person, basically had really good common sense, almost had that sense of foresight, predicting something might happen, being able to see the thing before it happened and acting. And so they said he was wise. Word there is bin. If you were going to write that out in English, there you go. It's B-I-Y-N, by the way. I typed that wrong. B-I-Y-N. It means wise, right? I just said all those things. So let's take a look at how that works in Proverbs. Look at Proverbs 1:5. It says, "Let the wise also hear and gain learning." Sounds a bit like Jesus, doesn't it? Let the wise also hear and gain learning, and the discerning acquire skill. Same word, bin, that comes up in Proverbs. It's in Genesis 3. It's throughout the Bible. So what I like to do is take a look at those words of wise and then see where that comes out in the New Testament. So what's the corresponding word? If wisdom is this literally to separate mentally, meaning I can really figure things out, I can distinguish, I can be prudent, how is it talked about in the New Testament? We're going to get to the word Jesus used. In the New Testament, it's found in Matthew 10:16. Remember when Jesus says, "Be wise as serpents." There's the word. It's phronimos, means sensible, being shrewd. You see that in the parable of the shrewd. I don't like that parable much, the shrewd manager, because he's really not a nice guy, but Jesus says he's shrewd. He's using the same word. Sensible, practical, wise. Now we get down to today. I said we're just dipping our toe in it. So wisdom's in the Old Testament. It goes by bin. In the New Testament, you see wise as serpents, wise being a shrewd manager, phronimos. It's the same equivalent, same meaning, basically the same word. Now, I read to you this parable of the wise builder and the foolish builder. And if you remember in verse 24, he said, if you want to be wise, phronimos, same word as the Old Testament, same word as wise as serpents, same word for Joseph as being very wise and being able to have foresight into things. If you want to do that, you want to be wise, right? He says, do these things. So what is Jesus talking about? The parable point. I hope you remember the parable. Guy goes out, builds on a rock. Guy goes out, builds on sand. Rains come. The guy with the rock, he makes it. The guy on sand. So this is, other words, this is Jesus' school of rock. Come on. It's Jesus' school of rock. He says, if you do these things, we're going to come back to that. If you do these things, it's like someone who begins to build a house. We just said it, right? Common sense, environmental deduction, right? You all know this. You know if you build a home on the beach in Florida, right? You know what the potential is. You know if you're in New Orleans and the hurricane comes when the Mississippi River's at its highest. You know what's going to happen. It's common sense that there's the potential for some very bad things to happen. So Jesus is saying, there's some common sense here. And I want you to do this, Jesus says. I want you to do these 10 common sense actions, these 10 common sense teachings that proceed. So I didn't read to you what comes first. He gives 10 actions, 10 behaviors. He said, if you do these things, it will make you a sensible wise, phronimos. It'll make you a sensible person. So, if the 10 things are so important that Jesus devotes this teaching parable about the wise and the foolish builder, right? And he wants to reinforce blessings and consequences using common sense, do you think we might want to back up and see what the 10 things are? That's where you say yes. Don't worry, we're not doing it today. That's what we're going to be looking at. If you want to be wise, if you want to be sensible, you want to be able to solve problems with common sense, you'll have to wait till next week. Amen.